My siblings, please reach out your hands in prayers over me. Most High, we ask that I may speak with your voice and that we may hear with your heart. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. This is the day our God has made. Let us rejoice and be glad. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. May Christ be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Good News according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Christ.
After the Sabbath, Mary Magdalene, Salome, and Mary, the mother of James, brought some spices to put on Jesus' body. Very early on Sunday morning, just as the sun was coming up, they went to the tomb. On their way, they were asking one another, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance for us?" But when they looked, they saw that the stone had already been rolled away, and it was a huge stone. The woman went into the tomb, and on the right hand, they saw a young man in a white robe sitting there. They were alarmed. The man said, "Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus from Nazareth, who was nailed to a cross. God has raised him to life. He isn't here. You can see the place where he put his body. Now go and tell his disciples, and especially Peter, that he will go ahead of you to Galilee. You will see him there, just as he told you." When the women ran from the tomb, they were confused and shaking all over. They were too afraid to tell anyone what had happened. Believe it or not, the early version of Mark stops right there. We have two different versions of endings that got stacked on after that. That basically are the, and everyone got told and things happened sort of vibe. But it stops right there with a cliffhanger. And so I want us to think about that. I'm going to stop it there too and say, this is the gospel of our Christ.
Praise to you, O Christ.
And then we're going to dig into that. Because you know, it was the women who came. In fact, 3 days earlier, it was the woman who doggone well stayed. Throughout this whole episode, the men saw it off on a regular basis. And the women step up. And here, the women are told to go bring the guys back in. Do you notice how it said it, especially Peter? Remember the last time we saw Peter in the story? I don't know him. I swear I don't know. What are you talking about? I don't know him. And then you hear the rooster. It's the last time we saw Peter. Go tell the disciples and then go find Peter wherever he's hiding. And tell him he's welcome too. This is not Peter the leader here. It's Peter the mortified, who's probably pulled some rug over his head and is hiding. Go find the boys and go get Peter. And I want to point out that even in this cliffhanger ending of Mark, it's meaning that yes, they went and told the disciples. But Mark is the secret gospel. I do this thing, don't tell anyone. I do this thing, don't tell anyone. I do this thing, don't tell anyone. So here we've got kind of the last piece of that. He's resurrected. I can't tell everyone that. Can you imagine? Oh yeah, the guy that you saw murdered completely publicly, I saw him in a tomb. He's alive. That's not going to sell on the public stage, right? And I think that's part of why it stopped at that cliffhanger. But people were so unhappy with it that they started pasting endings onto it. And, you know, people like to tidy up stories. And they usually, you notice when they tidy up the story the way they want it to go. Anybody else notice this? So we have men centering themselves when clearly they weren't there. We have people centering their own stories, which is what we as humans do. We center our own story. And one of the fascinating things about the number of trans clergy that I know is that we've all been buzzing over this last few weeks with the Trans Day of Visibility, Christ is risen. You know, there's a thing here. And we've all been talking about it. And I would be willing to bet before there were trans clergy, this was not being talked about. And y'all have heard from me the whole thing that if we're going to be literalists here, the only genetics that contributed to Christ were X's. Only had Mary. So by definition, there's something really hardcore trans about Jesus. And he felt his truth. He knew his truth. He spoke his truth. He challenged other people to cope with his truth. And they went and hung on a cross for it. Does that sound at all like the community? And he rose. And he rose in glory in a body without flaws. And doesn't that sound like our King? Right, Lee? When we talk about all the things Jesus gets, we don't tend to talk about that. But the truth is that we've all got the thing that we're embarrassed about inside us. The thing we know, but we can't find words for. Times we have felt confused and shaking all over and too afraid to tell anyone what had happened. We all have that. And Christ has walked through that too. And Christ leads us through that too. The reason why we use the paschal candle is the beacon. It's meant to remind us of that light shining before us. Think about last night as I bore that light before me, as I read our readings by its light. And remember also, and that goes back to the children of Israel fleeing Egypt, with a pillar of cloud to be clearly visible in the desert to follow, that moved behind them to guard their backs as a pillar of fire at night. We've got all those symbolisms there in this paschal candle. And then we add in the water of baptism. Water that cleanses, blesses, refreshes, like water to a thirsty soul. Part of our Catholicity is the visceralness, the tangibility of what we do in our believing. And so I want you to think about the reality of fire and flame. Here again, I'm glad that I'm not at our worship space where it would be real candle. But there's heat to that flame, right? I got to be careful with it. Revelation can be raw and rough and scary and burn you. We can't even have too much of water, right? And if you've ever gone under in salt water or cold water, you know that can be raw and rough and too much. And yet we burst forth. We burst back out of those waters of baptism. Amen. And those waters dripping on us bless the ground that we walk on. Because when we are dripping God, we bless the people we touch. So I want us all to have resurrection morning and a resurrection walk and a resurrection faith that is love and hope and radical welcome and a little bit queer. So let's talk about all the bits that I just stirred up. Like we stirred up the water. Let's share what the Spirit has said to us.